Hello everyone and welcome to this episode of the Railway Tales. Today we're going to be looking at a history of the world famous Flying Scotsman.
Chugging down the tracks, the whistle blows. Every mile a story, every stop a glow. From steam to diesel, the rails unwind. Railway tales take you on a ride through time. Hear the rhythm of the wheels, feel the heart of the rails. Stories unfold like tracks on endless trails. Through mountains, towns, and open plains. Come aboard, the journey remains. Railway tales, where the stories never end. On iron horses, with every bend. From sunrise rides to moonlit trails, hop on board, it's Railway Tales.
Locomotive number 4472, otherwise known as the Flying Scotsman, was built in 1923 in Doncaster for the then Great Northern Railway, which would later become the London North Eastern Railway, or LNER. Now, the locomotive Flying Scotsman was built by Sir Nigel Gresley, a world famous engineer at the time. It is also the first locomotive to officially reach 100 miles an hour. Now, we say 100 officially because there are some debate in the railway world between Flying Scotsman being the first or City of Truro, which I'll go into in another video. Although Flying Scotsman is considered the world's famous locomotive, there are many reasons for this. During its time in Mainline service, Flying Scotsman did the specialist train called the Flying Scotsman, ironically named after herself, leaving from London's King's Cross at 10 in the morning and arriving at Edinburgh Waverley around 8 hours later. Now, the Flying Scotsman train service itself is quite unique because it was the first non-stop run between London and Edinburgh. Previous trains to this had to stop for obviously crew changes, water, coal, and various other reasons. Now, when the Flying Scotsman locomotive first did this, it was around 1928 and it was modified with a corridor tender. Now, this allowed crew to change from the train to the locomotive without having to stop. The locomotive was also fitted with a water scoop underneath the tender to collect water whilst on the move. Luckily, the coal capacity of around 9 tonnes was enough to get her from London to Scotland in one trip. In 1963, Alan Pegler became the first locomotive owner for Flying Scotsman and purchased the engine directly from British Railways at the end of steam. In 1963, Alan Pegler had support from the then Prime Minister, Mr. Harold Wilson, who spent loads of money over the time to repair and restore locomotive Flying Scotsman into her LNER condition from around 1928 to 1936, and it even put the corridor tender back on. During this time as well, Alan Pegler was also running mainline tours with Flying Scotsman and of course another famous locomotive, Mallard. These were running after steam had finished on the main line in the United Kingdom. In 1966, Alan Pegler noticed that there was hardly any water facilities for steam locomotives in the United Kingdom anymore, so he purchased a second tender for Flying Scotsman to be converted to just hold water, allowing the locomotive to have a larger range between water stops. In 1969, Flying Scotsman went on its ill-fated tour to the United States of America. At the time, it was backed by the then Prime Minister Harold Wilson to send Flying Scotsman to the United States and Canada to help promote British exports. To comply with the United States Railways regulations, the locomotive was fitted with a cowcatcher, a bell, Buckeye couplings and American 3-style chime whistle, along with air brakes and a high-intensity headlamp, all of which you can see in the photo above. In 1969, the tour ran from Boston to New York City, then on to Washington DC and Dallas. And in 1970, the British government changed, and unfortunately, Prime Minister at the time was Edward Heath, and he did not support the venture for Flying Scotsman. Albeit, while the Scotsman was still in America, Alan Pegler decided to continue the tour, and the tour carried on in 1970 from Texas to Wisconsin, finishing up in Montreal in 1970. Now, the costs were phenomenal for these tours on Flying Scotsman, not just the upkeep on the locomotive, but other sundry costs as well. Unfortunately, Alan Pegler ran into debt whilst the United States tour was happening. Now, in 1971, they managed to run from Toronto to San Francisco with Flying Scotsman, where she finished her run. Unfortunately, when she got to San Francisco, Alan Pegler was in severe debt and had no money. During this time, Flying Scotsman was put into storage at US Army Sharp Depot in San Francisco, California, to keep it away from the creditors coming to collect the money Alan Pegler owed. Alan Pegler came back to the UK in 1971 and was declared bankrupt by the UK High Courts in 1972. But Scotsman stayed in America. Fears arose when the locomotive stayed in the USA. However, salvation came from Sir William McAlpine, who purchased the locomotive, paid off all the debts owed to the locomotive, and brought her back to the United Kingdom. She arrived in Liverpool in 1973, and Sir William was advised to put the locomotive on a low loader and take it back for restoration. However, Sir William McAlpine decided against this and made the locomotive travel under its own steam to Derby in front of crowds of onlookers. The locomotive went to Derby and was restored and was back on the main line by 1977. In 1988, by the invitation of the Australian government, Flying Scotsman travelled to Australia to take part in the country's bicentennial celebrations. These celebrations were called AusSteam 88, and during the event, Flying Scotsman also met up with other locomotives, one of which will surprise you. Now, Flying Scotsman was double-heading with a lot of Australian locomotives, including locomotive 3810, a Victorian Railways R-Class locomotive, and weirdly enough, another locomotive called Pendennis Castle. Now, Pendennis Castle's story is very interesting, and I'll go into that in another video. However, while we're talking about Flying Scotsman, she was travelling across Australia. Now, she happened to be the only locomotive in the world to circumnavigate the globe. obviously originating in the United Kingdom, going to America and now to Australia. Whilst on the tour, Flying Scotsman set another record from Alice Springs to Melbourne, travelling 679 kilometres or 422 miles, travelling between Parkes and Broken Hill non-stop, which is the longest such run for any steam locomotive ever recorded. The same journey also saw Flying Scotsman set its own haulage record when it took a 735-ton train over 490 miles between Toloka and Alice Springs. Thankfully, after this Australian tour, Flying Scotsman returned to the United Kingdom in 1990 and continued to work on the Mainline with her certificate running until 1993. During this time, Flying Scotsman was changed from the LNER livery to the BR green livery, fitted with double chimneys and German style smoke deflectors. Now, by 1995, it was in pieces, sadly, at the Southall Railway Centre in West London, and also gained another owner. Now, William McAlpine had not sold the locomotive, however he turned it into a company, and alongside him was railway enthusiast and music guru Pete Waterman, who helped look after the locomotive. Now, during 1996, salvation came again for Flying Scotsman, as sadly the consortium ran out of money and Tony Marchington purchased the locomotive and restored the locomotive back into mainline condition. Now, during this time, Tony Marchington also got the locomotive onto British TV, featuring in the Channel 4 programme A Steam Affair, the story of Flying Scotsman. Now, during this time, Flying Scotsman was still working on the main line, pulling VSOE Pullman trains, along with a proposed construction of a Flying Scotsman village in Edinburgh. Now, sadly, this never came about, and Tony Marchington sadly ran out of money. It seems to be a running thing with locomotive owners of Flying Scotsman. But, however, salvation was at hand in 2004. In February of 2004, the National Railway Museum of the United Kingdom purchased the locomotive Flying Scotsman for £2.3 million. The bulk of the money was raised through a National Heritage Memorial Fund standing at £1.8 million, and the remainder coming from donations and being matched by Sir Richard Branson to also help save the locomotive. Now, Flying Scotsman had needed some severe work after her long lifetime and hadn't actually had a full overhaul. So during 2006, the National Railway Museum announced that they would be putting the locomotive into overhaul. Sadly, the funds were not enough at the time, and the locomotive had more problems than the National Railway Museum expected. Sadly, the works for the locomotive carried on until 2016. Finally, when the overhaul was finished in January of 2016, the locomotive came out wearing her wartime livery, being numbered at number 103 and 502 on the cab sides, and was out hauling trains near the end of January the same year. In September of 2016, the National Railway Museum announced the final cost for the restoration of Flying Scotsman. This cost came to a staggering £4.5 million to restore the locomotive completely from every nut and bolt. Now, at this opportune moment in the video, I'm going to talk about some interesting facts that you don't know about Flying Scotsman. Also, in 1927 at London King's Cross Station, Flying Scotsman was put alongside a third scale model called Typhoon, which works on the Romney Hythe and Dymchurch Railway. And in 2017, for the 90th anniversary of that railway, the two locomotives met again, but this time at the Bluebell Railway in East Sussex. Also, the Flying Scotsman locomotive has featured in not one, but 3 movies. Her first appearance was in 1929 of a film with the same name, which featured a sequence on board the locomotive. Funny story, back then you could also get a haircut whilst on the train to Scotland. Imagine that now. Also, the next movie was called Agatha in 1979 and was disguised as 2 other members of the class named Victor Wilde on one side and Emprise on the other side. Now, in the year 2000, Flying Scotsman also featured in the movie 102 Dalmatians. However, it was dubbed with a bell despite it not actually having one other than in the USA tour. Flying Scotsman has also featured in Hornby Railway models throughout the years, and famously in 2011 a Triang Hornby version was featured on the TV show James May's A Toy's Story. In 2018, Flying Scotsman featured in the video game Railway Empire, of which I have played and is awesome. In 2001, Flying Scotsman was the front cover locomotive on the first simulation game called Microsoft Train Simulator, and Flying Scotsman has also featured in a racing game as well. Back in 2018, Flying Scotsman was featured in Forza Horizon 4, set in the United Kingdom, where you can race alongside Flying Scotsman in a tournament. However, the locomotive's whistle in the game is not the real loco's whistle. It is another American loco's whistle, Canadian Pacific number 136. Now, Flying Scotsman has also featured in the famous, by its own right, series, the Thomas the Tank Engine series. It featured first in book number 23, called Enterprising Engines, and was featured on the TV in season 3 with just her tenders showing out of the shed. In 2016, Flying Scotsman get the full CGI experience by being part of the movie The Great Race, which in the movie Interesting fact, there is a little note to the original books where Flying Scotsman is told to be Gordon's brother. Whew. What a history for one famous locomotive. Now, if you have enjoyed this video, please do give it a like and also subscribe while you're down there as well to keep up to date with all the Railway Tales videos that are coming out. And hopefully you enjoyed the video. I definitely enjoyed making this one and looking into the locomotive itself and all its little reincarnations, shall we say, in different features. Now, I will see you all on the next one. And remember, this is the home of the Railway Tales.